welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be getting into reinventing every time the music changes. Let's go. Okay, so this one's going to be very idea quote driven, this video. So bear with me. I'm going to pull a lot of kind of quotes from different places, but I hope by the end of this video we're still together and it still makes sense. Okay, so the idea of reinvent every time the music changes is actually a lyric from the late Nipsey Hussle. And in it, it's a song that he's actually featured on by The Neighborhood called Living in a Dream. And in his verse, he basically said this line, reinvent every time the music changed. My gut had me feeling like I knew the way.
Reinvent every time the music changed. My gut had me feeling like I knew the way.
And in that, at least what I take from it, is this idea of understanding that in our journey in life, there's times where the scripts, the playbooks, the frameworks that we had might have been relevant and might have been helpful for a particular point, but in trying to get to a new point in our life or a new point in our career, a new point in our relationships, we have to really assess what we're working with and sometimes kind of rip up the old playbook and build out new systems in the context of understanding where we currently are in the world. I think one of the most interesting reinventions, or at least attempts to reinvent, that we've seen has been this new proliferation of cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology. I think cryptocurrencies in particular have got a bad rep, kind of as the pump and dump schemes. A lot of people, especially retail investors, obviously trying to profit from the volatility of the market, kind of pumping coins and trying to see if they can get those 5x, 10x, 100x that are sometimes kind of published and publicized on social media. But if we look at the actual value prop or the thesis that's being presented by cryptocurrency, let's take, for example, Bitcoin, which is the premier cryptocurrency at the moment, that kind of kicked off the spur of all the cryptocurrencies that we currently see. Cryptocurrency was asking the question, is there a way in which we can transact value digitally? And that question was actually being asked. Obviously, Satoshi in his white paper kind of lays it out in the fundamental aspects, but that came as a direct consequence of the 2007 and 2008 global financial crash, right? So a lot of people lost faith in the current systems of finance that we currently have and the capital markets and the way in which kind of value is transferred, at least in that particular industry, and how we kind of had scathing impacts into other industries such as real estate, even healthcare, education to some extent as well, kind of government policy having to change in accordance with the fact that kind of large deficits were being financed by these players and now kind of are gone. And I think the question that we're asking, or the question that's being asked with cryptocurrency, is can we find new ways to transact digitally? And I think that's a really good question, especially as we become more digital, especially as we look to engage more online, as we become more and more digitally native, and the generations that kind of follow us become more and more digitally native, right? So obviously I was born kind of in the middle. I still remember kind of going outside to play. Ooh, short car. Still remember playing outside, where some people, a lot of the younger generation, they were born with iPads, right? They were born with iPads in their hand. They were born playing games. That's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. I think the jury's still out on that. But it does say that there is a new way in which the world is kind of engaging. I was reading an article, and in the article it stipulated that for a lot of people in this new generation, let's say anywhere, I think there's Gen Z, and there's a new one, there's a Gen Alpha. I forgot the new one, but they make names every single time the children are born. But there's the new Gen after the Gen Z. But with them, it's this idea that their first jobs won't be physical jobs, right? Their first jobs will be on the internet, whether that's video editing, whether that is making websites, whether that is coding kind of SaaS software. Those will be their first jobs, right? And I think, or whether that's making logos for people, those are the ways in which they will be able to kind of earn money. Whereas for me, it was paper rounds. It was, how did I make money? My sister did cake stalls. What did we do? We used to make water balloons and sell water balloons, and if no one bought them, then we'll just throw them. But yeah, so those are the ways in which, and now, if you can notice, the tide is changing, right? So how do we reinvent in this current context? How do we look to engage with the world, not as we knew it to be, but as it currently is, and as it will continue to be? Number one. Number one is think from first principles, right? sure, kind of like, and to be fair, sometimes I hear people say, oh, first principles, and it's a way in which you can kind of sound smart. Oh, I'm just thinking from first principles. But ultimately what that is just you kind of questioning the validity of your stance and trying to break down your point or your reasoning to the purest forms of truth that you can identify from that particular idea, right? So in first principles, there's 3 steps ultimately. The first step is to identify your assumptions. We all have assumptions. We all have blind spots that are based on our experiences, the way in which we were raised, our childhood, and just the way in which we interact with the world. So identify your assumptions and bring them to the fore when you're having discussions or when you are critically reasoning about an idea. Just understand that you might have a bias or you might have a slightly kind of like skewed opinion just on the basis of your assumptions. The second is to break down the problem, right? When you break down the problem, you're asking ultimately, what am I trying to solve? And that actually becomes, sometimes, you know what, that's actually a very difficult question in a lot of context when you ask yourself, what am I actually trying to solve? What am I trying to do here? What am I trying to do here, mate? You feel me? Sorry, I don't know why I just said that. But what am I trying to do here? What am I trying to do? How am I trying to work this situation? What do I want to solve? What is the intended outcome for this? I think that's a really important thing to do. Break down the problem, also what you're trying to do. And with the basis of those 2 things, the clarity that you will get from breaking down the problem, ask yourself, what am I trying to achieve? What is the outcome I want? Whilst identifying your potential assumptions, you're able to create new solutions. And that is ultimately first principles thinking. Step 1, identify assumptions. Step 2, break down the problem. Step 3, create new solutions. And first principle that this description I think is really helpful. First principles thinking requires breaking down a problem into its fundamental building blocks. So its essential elements, asking powerful questions, getting down to the basic truth, separating facts from assumptions, and then creating and constructing a view from the ground up, right? So let's see if this works. I'm going to try and get an example. So if you can, just imagine that there's a building here, and the building has a lot of bricks. A lot of the time, especially in this world, in the developed world that we participate in, we can see buildings and we can be like, oh, it's already been built, great, stuff like that, cool, whatever. But we also understand that that building is a collection and amalgamation of different bricks that were pieced together to ultimately form what we can now see. And first principles asks the question, let me isolate all of those bricks. I see the building, that's great. Let me isolate all of those bricks and then let me build it up again. So that in doing so, you have an understanding of the true fundamental status of that building and what it means, not just to you, but what it also can mean to other people as well. That's first principles. And how do you apply first principles in your life? First principles is asking why. So why do I believe this to be true? Or are there any assumptions in my thought process that I haven't aligned effectively with the truth? My favorite type of you. And the second thing that is helpful for us as we look to reinvent, as this music is changing, is to build out our worldview. Ooh. And sometimes when people say worldview, it sounds like this really big, grand idea that you might have. But ultimately, your worldview is just the way in which you think about the world. The way in which you view the world is your worldview.
Duh.
Sorry, I know, my bad. But yeah, that's ultimately it, right? It's the systems in which you understand the world through. It's the frameworks, and it's the way in which you perceive the world to be. And this is really important because sometimes we think that a lot of people share the same worldview as us, but maybe based on the ways in which we've grown up. Maybe we share the same families, or we think that, yeah, everyone must think like I do, or everyone must think about this. But it's not. We have a unique worldview based on a myriad of things: our experiences in life, our childhood, the schools that we went to, the countries that we lived in, the places we've traveled to. So I think it's important for us to build out our worldview. And the first thing is to ask currently, what is your worldview? And a way in which to understand your worldview, the first thing to ask yourself is what do I care about in this world? And by asking yourself, what do I care about in this world, you can then understand, once you identify your assumptions and you identify from first principles, why do you care about these things? Is it a particular experience? Is it something that you've that maybe someone close to you has experienced? Is it something that maybe you just watched or you read when you were younger and it's had a profound impact on you ever since? Is it just maybe the content that you consume and the ways in which you view the world that have ultimately helped to kind of like provide you with this choice? Yeah, so I think and one of the things or the frameworks, and we're going to discuss it later, but I think it's also helpful is how I really enjoy using literature, both non-fiction and fiction, in helping to build my worldview. And I think when thinking about building out our worldview, I think there are a few things. There are so many ways to do it, right? We can engage with different content. We can listen to people that we might not necessarily agree with, or we might not necessarily thought we have agreed with, and understand why do they think like that? Why don't I think like that? What are the assumptions that this person might have or might think that I recognize that isn't the truth? And in doing so, you're able to build out your worldview. I think one of the best ways to build out your worldview naturally is to travel. Travel as much as possible and discuss experiences with other people, right? And the second is to read books, fiction and non-fiction. By reading books, you engage not just with, obviously from a fictional perspective, with the author's understanding of the world or the world the author is trying to create. You're provided empathy to understand someone else's experience in terms of fictional character, but also with non-fiction, especially from maybe like historical perspectives, autobiographies, or just kind of like commentaries on particular points of time. You're able to also understand history. You're able also to understand the people that have come before you and the ways in which they view the world. And then you're able to measure it up with our current context as to was it true, was it not true, what were some of the assumptions that they had that you've now recognized or have now been kind of clearly shown that wasn't the case. And in doing so, you're able to refine the way in which you think about the world, which is really, really cool. There's a quote that I love by Mark Twain, and in it he says, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." And I love that because I think it's really, really helpful for us to think about in terms of the way in which we engage with historical characters and we engage with historical times. And I think that's really helpful in building out our worldview. And I think a great example of this is if you ever engage with a piece of art, whether that's a book, whether that's music, whether that's visual art in a gallery, or whether you go to a museum, ask yourself the question, when you see something that you really like, or you hear something that you really listen to, or you read something that just captures you, ask yourself, why do I like this? It'll be very hard to answer that question because it's natural to you, but interrogate yourself. Ask yourself, why do I like this? Why? What about this piece of art that sometimes might not have captivated anyone else or captured anyone else, but it's just like enamored me? Why is that the case? And in doing so, you're able to kind of create more clarity about yourself, for yourself. And in doing so, it allows you to help create a better worldview, a better picture of yourself. So all of this means that we're entering and we're participating in a radically changing world. I was at a talk a few years ago, and in the talk, the keynote speaker said something like that always stuck with me. He said that the pace of change will never be this slow. And if we think about how fast things have innovated, if we think about how fast things that we have normally seen has changed, we'll actually understand that it's very, very scary and very interesting. I take, for example, I always tell my friends, like, money, right? 10 years ago, it was cash, right? Cash, give cash. And then very quickly it became credit cards. And then very quickly credit cards became contactless. And very quickly contactless became Apple Pay. And for me, I don't know if it's the same with you guys, but I hardly ever use cash. Right? It's a very, very rare experience for me using cash in its current context. It's very much I'm using Apple Pay, and at the worst I'm tapping my credit card or chip and pin sometimes. When you travel, I don't know if you guys have had that, when you travel and they don't accept Apple, like contactless, so you have to just do chip and pin or swipe if you're in America, which is super weird to me, but you gotta do what you gotta do. But that was all to say this idea that the way in which we're engaging with the world is changing at a pace that is incredibly quick, and it's important for us to engage with this. And just to compound on this, like a point that I actually want to share, I'll put it on the screen so you should see it. Yeah, so this is about Jaja Of Opobo. So he was the founder of Opobo, and please, sorry if I'm butchering it, but he was the founder of Opobo city-state, which is now in present-day Rivers State, Nigeria. But obviously he worked as a kind of like a apprentice, servanthood. He worked as an apprentice and then managed to kind of buy his way out of that and ultimately kind of like became a successful merchant. And I I bought his books because I think it was really interesting because I wanted to learn more about it. And in one of his books that I read, there was this part that like has stuck with me ever since. It says, Jaja's trade and prosperity was founded not on the old trade in slaves, but on the rising trade in palm oil. Indeed, the fact that, unlike most of the established traders, he did not have to make the transition from one to the other might have contributed to his success once he began to apply himself seriously to commercial affairs. Thus, although the facts are not entirely clear, it would appear that the determinant factor for success in the Delta trade of the mid-19th century was the ability to adjust to the changing needs of the international trading system and to achieve a reasonably smooth transition from the trade in slaves to the trade in palm oil. And I think that's really, really helpful. That was really helpful framing for me to understand that at the time, the ways in which the world is currently changing and where I feel like would be the most helpful place for me to position myself to benefit from the changes in this world. Reinvent every time the music changed. My gut had me feeling like I knew the way. And why this Jaja Of Opobo quote is so important for us to think about is because it provides us the understanding that this was in the mid-19th century now. But the truth still remains the same, that there was a trade that was becoming redundant. Thank goodness it was the trade in slaves that was becoming redundant. And there was a new trade at the time that was kind of coming into play, coming into the fore. And the same can be said at any point in history, right? There will always be kind of like something rising and something falling at the same time, just by virtue of kind of human ingenuity and innovation. So the question is, at this current juncture, what is that for us? And that's the question I've spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to answer for myself, creating just a framework for myself that I've built, that I've questioned, that I've shared potentially with other people, instead of a playbook that I was given by someone else that was operating in a different time. I think the onus is on me and us to kind of develop the playbook that we want to have going forward based on what we know about the world, but also including the fact that we might have some assumptions about the way the world works that might not be true. And interrogating those assumptions, breaking down the problems that we want to solve, our particular problems, and then working upwards, building it all again from kind of like the ground up, which is super important. So think about that. He was able to achieve success because he had the ability to adjust to the changing needs of the international trading system. So how can we do the same? That's the question that's on my mind. Just this idea of reinvent every time the music changes. Think about that. Think about how you could do that for yourself. And hopefully the tools about first principles thinking and also building out your worldview are helpful. Even if you don't want to reinvent when the music changes, you can use those to kind of like have kind of more clarity in the way in which you think, the way in which you reason, and hopefully kind of the conclusions that you come to that impact ultimately your life, your relationships, your friendships, your career, and the other things you're into, your business. So that's it. It's a great phrase by Wayne Gretzky. He said, or was at least claimed to have said, that he doesn't skate to where the puck has been, but he skates to where the puck is going. And to honor the late Nipsey Hussle, there's a song on this album, Victory Lap, status symbol 3. When I seen the game collapsing, cause they took the rules and whacked it, started moving at a different frequency and it had me living lavish. And on that note, peace.